Hello, and welcome to Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate. Here's our host, Charish Badzinski.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Exploring Intersections. This program is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Region 10. Over the coming months, we're talking with expert panelists about some of the biggest social issues of our time. If you have missed our past programs on gender equity, care of creation, and migration, you can still view them on YouTube or download a podcast version. Your feedback is really important to us. Please consider sharing your thoughts with us through a brief survey. You can find more information on the pinned post on our Facebook page. Today, our panel conversation is about racial justice. How do we navigate the long-term consequences of our nation's racist history? How do we support racial justice today and work to become a just society? And how does racial justice intersect with the critical issues of migration and climate? To help us better understand today's topic, we are joined by three panelists. Sister Mary Lou Specha, a member of the Congregation of the Sisters of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, has lived in New Orleans since 2008. A leader in the nonprofit and civic community, Sister Mary Lou was previously executive director of Cafe Reconcile, a nonprofit organization committed to interrupting the cycle of generational poverty and violence in New Orleans. Presently, she is executive director of Hotel Hope, an organization serving the most vulnerable in the community, women. Whatever the societal or economic barriers, homelessness, abuse, incarceration, poverty, behavioral health issues, lack of education, or jobs, Hotel Hope's programs and services are designed to promote and provide equal opportunities and a path to self-sufficiency in the lives of all women and their families. Sister Mary Lou has served on the Police Community Advisory Board to help reduce crime, address issues of bias-based policing, and improve interaction between the NOPD and citizens. She lives in Central City, an economically challenged neighborhood in New Orleans, where she is committed to neighborhood revitalization and diligent in addressing systemic racism and racial injustice in her ministry and daily interactions. Welcome, Sister Mary Lou.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with all of you this afternoon.
Born and raised in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, Emily Lazor has been a lifelong advocate in the pursuit of racial justice within the Catholic Church and its teachings. With an education in theology and religious studies at the Catholic University of America and a master's in education from Notre Dame's Alliance for Catholic Education Teaching Fellows program, Emily began teaching in Jackson, Mississippi, where she soon discovered her passion for teaching high school age students and helping them to realize their developing social awareness. Growing up biracial with very different personal experiences in both Asian American and white arenas, Emily has felt especially drawn to work that helps hold white Catholics accountable and committed to the Church's call to racial justice. Currently teaching AP Seminar and AP Research at Cristo Rey Dallas College Prep, Emily works with predominantly first-generation Mexican-American students as they pursue academic research around topics related to the common good and social justice. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me.
And Sister Patricia Rogers, a member of the Dominican Sisters of Sinsinawa, is Executive Director of the Dominican Center for Women in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She is dedicated to resident-led community development, providing support to the Amani neighborhood residents in the critical areas of safety, housing, economic development, education, and family well-being. In her senior year of high school, Sister Patricia was one of 10 students to integrate the all-white Northside High School in Fort Smith, Arkansas. While a layperson teaching in a predominantly Black Catholic high school in Chicago, she prayed for God's intervention for a sister of color to join the white sisters. God called her to fill the void. Her call to religious life led Sister Patricia to the mother house of the Sinsinawa Dominicans in Sinsinawa, Wisconsin, and she then served in the cities of Milwaukee, Tuskegee, and Montgomery, St. Louis, and New Orleans. Upon Sister Patricia's return to Milwaukee, she was co-chair for the Sinsinawa Anti-Racism Transformational Team for 5 years. Today, she serves on the leadership team of Coalition on Lead Emergency, which helps in creating a sustainable, lead-safe environment in Milwaukee. Welcome, Sister Patricia.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me.
Let's talk first about your foundation in this work for all three of you. When and how were you awakened to the issue of racial justice? And when did you realize that you wanted the pursuit of it to be part of your life's work? Emily, let's start with you.
I think growing up biracial, I learned about racial injustice very quickly, which I'm sure all people of color and all people who are biracial and multiracial can relate to. There's a reflection question that I find really interesting is when you ask people, when did you first realize you had a race? Usually young people that are people of color, are biracial, multiracial, that first experience is a negative one when they realize that they looked different or that they weren't in the white majority wherever they lived. Whereas usually young white people, when you ask them, when did you first realize you were white? It's usually something of interest and wonder. So I have lots of vivid memories from my childhood, and my brother does as well, kind of navigating very, very Filipino spaces and being the only biracial kids there, and then being in very predominantly white spaces, especially in our education, and navigating those spaces as well. So it's something that's always been on my mind. It's a big part of my personal experience and my own formation. But when I thought about it in terms of my life's work, when I was in college, I volunteered at a Catholic school in northeastern Washington, D.C. called St. Anthony's that served a predominantly Black student population, and they still do so very, very well. And so it really awakened me to this idea that Catholic schools in the United States were founded by sisters for immigrant student populations, for populations of people who generally were on the margins. And so for me, that really lit a fire in me to want to be in Catholic education, and Catholic education that predominantly serves students of color, and to do that really well as an act of justice. So in the United States, we have we assume that Catholic schools are generally for upper middle class or middle class white students, but I think in the latest data, they found that 21% of Catholic school students are students of color. And so our school is serving almost entirely students of color and trying to do that really well as an act of educational justice here in Dallas. So I think in a faith-based setting, you can do a lot of really beautiful work when it comes to thinking about race and identity and seeing your race, your culture as an asset and not as a deficit, which is oftentimes what culture or other communities tell us about our race. So for me, that pathway has definitely been Catholic education.
Great, wonderful. Sister Patricia, let's go to you next. Tell us about your foundation in this work and when and how you were awakened to the issue of racial justice.
I was awakened to this issue when I was in grade school. We would go downtown to meet my grandmother, and she was the chef of a well-known restaurant in the downtown area. So the first thing that I noticed was that we always had to meet her at the back door of this restaurant, and that she could only leave and enter through this back door. I think particularly as we walked the sidewalks in the downtown area of Fort Smith, what caught me most was as we walked down the sidewalk, if whites would meet us coming down the sidewalk, we would have to get off the sidewalk. And that was very disconcerting for me as a child, because there would be white children, either younger than I or older than I, who would not have to get off the sidewalk. So this was my earliest memory of this. But what has really hooked me into this work happens to be my mother's work with the NAACP in the early 50s through the 60s, when we had the integration of schools, buses, lunch counters. It was the wins that happened for those to be integrated that really hooked me.
Oh, I can imagine how powerful that must have been growing up. And Sister Mary Lou, how about for you? When were you first awakened to the issue of racial justice?
Thanks again for this conversation, a really important conversation. And I'm happy to try to share my perspectives. But I think I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. So if you know anything about Chicago and the south side, it's pretty segregated, and certainly was segregated in the 60s. So when I was about 10 years old, Martin Luther King moved to Chicago and lived within a certain area to really help promote some housing and address some of the housing issues that some of the African Americans were having. And so one of the things that they worked on is to have a march, and the march kind of went right through my neighborhood, and it was going to end in a very European park, Marquette Park, which was really my ethnicity. I'm Lithuanian and Polish, so there were a lot of people of that background and ethnicity living in that area. And we used to go to the park all the time. It was just a great place. It's a beautiful place in the midst of the concrete and all that in the city. And so Martin Luther King was going to march through our neighborhood and really found a lot of unrest. And actually, years later, after I have been reading about this, he said even with some of the marches that he've had in the South, in the Deep South, he never encountered such racial hatred as he did in Chicago, which just really breaks my heart, because that's my hometown, the place that reared me. And so I remember not being out there, but seeing it on television and seeing these images. And, in the 60s, we had a lot of unrest, somewhat like we have today, and so I remember seeing when Martin Luther King entered the park, he was struck with a bottle, or somebody threw something at him and it hit him in the head, and he went down immediately. And of course, people around him were very concerned. But as I witnessed that, and as I kind of saw that on the television, I remember asking my mom, like, Mom, what's going on? And some of the people that, perhaps were in my neighborhood were out there screaming and yelling not such nice things. And what I remember was my mom was silent. She didn't answer me. And as a very curious and kind of rambunctious child, I couldn't understand why there was nothing said. Mm-hmm. And so I think because of that silence, and as I went through my college years and early teens and in my 20s, it really became to me a place where if we want the world to change, we have to have a voice, and we have to really speak up against injustice and injustice and things that. So the passion that I have and the movement that I have today is to really help find my voice and speak the truth, but also help others find arenas to speak about some really important topics that aren't necessarily, things that we want to talk about at our dinner tables with the people we live with.
Great thoughts. Sister Patricia, let's start with you on this one. In what ways do discrimination and racism hold us all back?
I think, first of all, discrimination and racism really leads to a lack of opportunities for people to build family wealth, and also to get careers that would lead them out of poverty. And when these opportunities are missed, we see communities of poverty. And because of that, it's very expensive for cities and states to combat that poverty. So that's the intersection for all of us. And I think in order for us to get past that, we really have to see everyone as equal. And I think with the Catholic Church, I think the Catholic Church sees the right to life maybe as that piece for the Catholic Church. But because it isn't specific enough, it doesn't do the job that it should as far as racial justice is concerned. It talks about not only the unborn, but the born should have these opportunities to thrive and feel wanted and loved. But it should also say the born of all races should have these opportunities. Because the church isn't specific enough, and the country sometimes in the racial justice issues aren't specific enough. That's the reason why we have Black Lives Matter, just to bring it home that we have to be specific when we're talking about racial justice for all.
Yeah, absolutely. Emily, any thoughts to add to that about in what ways discrimination and racism hold us all back?
I mean, I wish Sister Patricia would just keep talking and then we could for an hour, but I think some kind of something underneath that umbrella that Sister Patricia just laid out is we can really see this in education, catechesis, youth ministry spaces, is we really center whiteness. So if you go to a youth ministry conference, if you look for catechetical resources online, the language, the things that are talked about, work under the assumption that the young people we're talking to have the young white experience. And we know that in the American church, it's becoming predominantly Latino. We know that the church is growing the most in Latin America, Asia, Africa. So we need to be talking about racial justice and discrimination because of what we believe about dignity of human life, but we also need to do it because it's the reality of the Catholic Church, that this is the diversity, this is the universality of our church. So if we really care about the church's future and the church surviving and thriving, we can't continue to center whiteness. We have to think about the experience of Nigerian American Catholics, of Mexican American Catholics, of Vietnamese American Catholics. And I don't think we're quite there, but, in terms of how we lift up those voices and we say, you know, this isn't just kind of a sidebar to American Catholicism, this is American Catholicism, but we're not there yet in terms of Catholic education, youth ministry, catechesis.
Mm-hmm. And Sister Mary Lou, anything to add to that?
Sure. I guess I would echo Patricia about opportunities. And what I see here in my work in New Orleans is that it's a tale of two cities, that there's opportunities for some and not opportunities for others. And so as we have navigated after Hurricane Katrina and our public school system is better, most of the people who want a good education send their child to private school. But most people that are working perhaps in a job that is making $10 an hour or whatever are unable to send their children to the private school. Mm-hmm. So that opportunity of education really, there are such great gaps. And really hold people back in what's possible and what's available to others. I think that's one of the things. I also think in the Catholic Church, we sometimes, I belong to, it's a pretty segregated church, but I would call it the Black church, but it's segregated. And we also have Latino. So we have the best of all worlds, I guess. We don't have a Vietnamese population. They live in a little bit other part of town. But one of the things that really that prejudice and racism holds back is the celebration of culture. and to really celebrate who we are as a people and what culture brings into that spice. So one of the exciting things, we just had an ordination on Saturday, and one of the local men who was ordained is from here, and he's young. And so what they did is they brought the Mardi Gras Indians. After his first mass, they had him come out of the church with the Mardi Gras Indians. If you don't know what that is, YouTube it and you'll see. And then they had the brass band, and then had him with an umbrella dancing. And he was, I mean, he'd been dancing all his life in the second lines. And so I was thinking about that as a white person, and as a white person from the Midwest, seeing this Black man, this priest, really celebrate. And I know the guy, so I was so excited. But I think sometimes our excitement of seeing something different like that brings upon another level of prejudice, or like, what's that priest doing? Or, and then they had the two bishops standing in the background who are also African-American. So they were like, get into it. So it's something that our white church has not seen, and we really need to open ourselves up and experience prayer in so many different ways to really open up our hearts to new things.
Yeah, Sister Mary Lou, I also grew up in the upper Midwest, and that Scandinavian stoicism could definitely use a little shakeup, I think. So let's talk about the Catholic Church as a whole. What does racial justice look like in the Catholic Church and in our country as a whole? Sister Patricia, let's start with you.
I think at this point, racial justice in the Catholic Church really needs some help, because if there really was racial justice within our church, we would see more people who look like myself or Emily. We would see them as sisters. We would see them as priests. And that just isn't happening at this point in time. So I think that our rhetoric is good in the Catholic Church about racial justice, but it just has not panned out so that we can see it, or that we can even celebrate it.
Mm-hmm. Emily, anything to add to that?
Definitely. I'm a product of many, many years of Catholic education. I went to the Catholic University of America and Notre Dame, which are just the most Catholic places you could go to school. And not once in my education did I really learn about non-European saints. Did I really learn about the role of the Catholic Church in American slavery? That's something I've learned now as a 31-year-old, is our church's role within slavery during that time, or even in a more positive sense, the church's role during the American Civil Rights Movement. These are not things we learn about, we're formed in. And I think that's really powerful. In order to move forward, we need to know our church's role in that history as well. But like Sister Patricia said, we have this rich teaching of the dignity of human life, which is foundational to all of our other teaching. We have these teachings of solidarity and the common good, which are so Catholic and so rich. But I don't think I've ever heard a homily about racism in my many, many years of being Catholic. I can't think of any Catholic conferences where racism was really centered, even though that's so paramount to the American experience, as we've really been reckoning with the past couple of years in the news. So when I think about racial justice in the church, we need to understand our church's history within racism. We need to reckon with our own position and all of that and what we do about that. But we have to see, I think if we really wanted to talk about racism in the church, we would. And so I think the reality is maybe there's folks that don't want to talk about it or are not ready to talk about it. The teaching is there, the history is there, and I think if we wanted to talk about it more, we would. So I think many Catholics of color, many white Catholics like Sister Mary Lou is talking about, are reckoning with that more, but we need our own church reckoning as well, in the same way that the United States is going through that reckoning currently.
Mm-hmm. Sister Mary Lou, anything to add to that?
Yeah, well said, both of you. And again, as a person, non-color, or I mean, white. You know, when you look at white, what's really white? Patricia's shirt is white. I don't look like that, but anyway, as we really look at that, it's a struggle. I think it's a struggle for me. But one of the stories that I learned when I moved here, I was in a parish prayer group, and we were studying some things. And one of the women, it was a mixed group of African Americans and Europeans. And one of the things that one of the people shared was during Jim Crow, she was like 8th grader. They were, teenagers or preteens or whatever. And they walked to church, her and her friend. And the Black people sat in the church in a certain section. They could only sit in a certain section. Like when I heard that, I was like, what? And this is in my lifetime. And so they went to sit in the Black section because both of them were African Americans. One of the girls was a little lighter skinned. And so the usher came up and said to them, you can't sit here, because he thought one of the persons was white. And so when I listened to that in that history, and I don't know how much more we have changed as far as when we look at our Sunday worship, many of our places are so segregated, and it's really kind of it's a sad commentary. We have the bishops writing and things, but how many people have really broken open the pastoral that they just wrote to really be able to say, okay, what are we doing? What are communities doing? And what as a white community doing to really address some of the things? Sometimes I think, I'm not going to take all the sins of the white people, but I think as a white person, sometimes we think, well, this isn't my issue because I don't have any people of color in my community, and it's for other people, and it's not for me, but it's for all of us. And for our church, Jesus was about an egalitarian community, and it was about equals. And so he faced racism, he faced injustice. And so here we are 2,000 years later, still struggling. But I think it's telling the stories. When I heard that story, and I heard it probably almost 10 years ago, it really still sticks in my head and my heart to say, what is somebody saying to somebody? They know who they are. They know who they are. And so who am I to tell somebody else? And it's still happening today. That's the sad part and the scary part of it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This, what you were talking about, Sister Mary Lou, makes me think of a trip I took about, before the pandemic, to Bethlehem. And they took the tour group to a gift shop. And I searched high and low, but I tell you what, every baby Jesus in that gift shop was white. And that is really telling to me. And so I think it's clear, of course, that these issues still exist today. One question that I have is the role of reparations. Are reparations a necessary component to achieving racial justice? And if so, what might reparations look like? Emily, let's start with you.
I mean, talk about a very relevant and hot button topic, but I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Last summer, in particular, I just posted on my Instagram story, I'm organizing people to give money to Black Catholic organizations. I was just thinking about reparations. I was thinking about reparations in the Catholic context. And I was so surprised by the thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars we ended up donating to Black Catholic organizations just through an Instagram post or a Facebook post, because I think a lot of Catholics want to do something, but they don't know where to start. So I think a great place to start when we think about reparations in the Catholic context is to give to the National Black Catholic Sisters Foundation or organization, to give to the National Catholic Black Seminarians Fund, to look up the historically Black Catholic school in your neighborhood that really needs financial assistance, because a lot of schools like ours are providing a tuition-free or almost tuition-free education for students of color. And then something more recently, which I think is deeply Catholic as well, is to think more about mutual aid organizations, and to give to organizations that are really on the ground, to give peer-to-peer. Sometimes I know that that's very radical when we start the reparations conversation, but I think we need to be talking more about mutual aid organizations. I think Black Catholic nonprofits are a great place to start, though, if this is something you are feeling like is calling you or pulling you to do.
Great. Sister Patricia, your thoughts on reparations?
Well, hold on to your hat. Yes, I think reparation is in order. When we think of a country that denied people of color from education, from building family wealth, we have to think of reparation. And so what it would look like for me is that every person of color who has applied to a college or a university and has been accepted should be able to go free. Free tuition, free room and board, free books. And that should happen for all people of color for 400 years going forward. I know that's big, but that's where I am.
I love it. I love that you're bringing it, Sister Patricia. We're not afraid. Sister Mary Lou, any thoughts on reparation?
I think it's, of course it's necessary. And I think our government has to step up and do something as well. I was doing a little reading and came across that there was, since 1989, for over 30 years, every year in the Congress, that there's been a House resolution to study the legacy of slavery and its ongoing harm, and to develop proposals to the damage it done to help with the reparations. It has been stuck there for since 1989. Now it just got out of the committee, and now it's going to go to the House floor. So I think it's like unbelievable. Now, I was talking to one of my colleagues and was asking her, some of these questions about reparations and things. And she's African-American. And she said, the Asian bill that came through, and she was happy about this, passed right away. It went and things because of the pandemic and all of that. And it passed. And she said, can you help me understand why we have been fighting for over 400 years, and there won't even be an acknowledgement of the African-American. What we have built upon of this country's wealth is on the backs of our brothers and sisters. I just realized my phone's ringing, so I'm going to put it on mute and go to the next question.
Perfect. Let's talk about vocations. Another big issue that the Catholic Church is facing right now. How can the pursuit of racial justice actually support vocations? Emily, let's start with you.
Yes, recently, one of my seniors, I teach a year-long research class, and I work at a Christ Ray school. If anyone's familiar with those, there's about 35 Christ Ray schools across the network. We work to serve low-income students who are predominantly first-generation college goers. And what she did was she read the research about when young adult Catholics disaffiliate with the church. And she found that all the research shows that most young Catholics leave Catholicism within the first 2 years out of high school, or you could say their first 2 years in college. And so what she did was she surveyed graduates of our school network, which are predominantly first-generation Americans, predominantly brown and black students. And she surveyed them, and they said they had to have grown up Catholic, they had to be affiliated with Catholicism. And she found that overwhelmingly so, these students were still practicing. And so it opened up this really interesting conversation around that most research is done at predominantly white institutions with predominantly white students. And the reality is that Mexican American students or Caribbean American students or Nigerian American students are holding on to their faith. But that doesn't mean our students are necessarily receiving the vocational resources that students in upper middle class, where they believe the vocation crisis is happening, we're not receiving the same resources as them. So I think a lot about that. I think a lot about our school doesn't have a chaplain, and I think a lot about the untapped vocations in our school community. And another thing relatedly I think about is I see in a lot of our students is they start wondering if the church is really for them, because their experiences of being first generation, their experience within immigration, their experiences of ICE, their experiences of racism aren't really being discussed in the church. And if that's my experience and I want a faith where I can bring my whole self and my own suffering and my own experiences, if that's not being discussed by this institution, is this institution really for me? And so I think as a church, we really need to think about that. It's a risk to talk about these things, right? It's uncomfortable to talk about these things, but imagine how countercultural it would be if young people saw a church that was like Jesus and unafraid to talk about these things that are subversive or countercultural. I think for many of the young people I work with, that would make the church really attractive to them. Like, oh, maybe this is a church for me. But right now they feel like the church is more about wholesomeness than it is about holiness. And holiness is about brokenness and bringing your whole self, and it's about redemption. It's about growth, right? And they see it as you have to be perfect. You have to look and seem a certain way. And that's not me. So I think about vocations in those two ways. One way being young people of color are not leaving the church, and what are we going to do about that? And the second way being that the more we talk about these topics within the church, the more attractive the church and relevant the church is going to become to young people.
Beautifully said. Sister Patricia, I bet that you have thoughts on this as well, as a sister who was called to join the White Sisters. How can the pursuit of racial justice support vocations?
I think the church has to be more welcoming of people of color. There are still people of color that go from church to church to church before they even feel welcome. So that's one of the issues. How are we going to make people of color feel welcome? I know one of the issues that I've had in some churches is going to communion and being worried about the person behind me, if they will take from the cup, if I take first, and holding that as a worry. And that never should be a worry. The other piece is that I was 24 years old before I even knew or ever saw a person of color as a sister or even a priest. There's a commercial out right now that says, if you can see it, you can be it. Well, there aren't enough of us for people to even see it. Even in the work that I've been doing, I know it was about 5 years in, and we were walking the neighborhood with the older person, and the older person was walking beside me, and a person came by and said, "Hey, sister, how you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm doing fine." And somebody else made another comment about sister, and it was a light bulb for him. He said to me, "You're a religious sister? Is that why they call you sister?" So, that's the issue, is that if you can't believe it and see it, if you can't see it, you don't believe it, and you don't aspire to be it. So the visibility is another issue.
Wonderful. So I definitely want to get to our questions about the intersections of racial justice with our other three main topic areas. So let's talk about climate justice and racial justice. How do those two topics overlap? And I'm just going to open it up to anyone at this point.
Well, I will start this off. We know that the largest or the wealthiest countries are the big polluters on our planet. And we know that the weather disasters, really, they're the ones that devastate the smaller countries. The intersection comes when the wealthier countries like ourselves can, first of all, take years to decide, is climate change really real? Is there such a thing? And then we have the nerve to be able to say whether or not we will participate in correcting some of these things or eliminating our carbon footprint. And while still the smaller countries, which are countries of color, continue to go through these disasters, that we have all the time in the world to make a decision about how we're going to even look at the issue while we care nothing about the disasters that they're going through.
Emily, anything to add to that?
I've learned so much about this topic from 16 and 17-year-olds. They are on fire about this. So in our AP Environmental Science class and with our environmental club, they have been great about helping other students understand that environmental justice is racial justice. And so in communities like ours, where our school is located, we are affected by environmental issues that people on the north side of our city are not affected by. And so my students have taught me so much about the research around pollution, the research around the health of soil in different neighborhoods. And something they've been really great about too is talking about environmental issues in an intersectional way. So we tend to think about environmental topics. People tend to think about people who are pro-environment as like hippie white folks. This is kind of the stereotype, but people of color are the most affected by these environmental issues. So just doing a lot of research around intersectional environmental justice is really powerful. There's so much out there. People are starting to talk about it more. There's a lot of great Instagram accounts to follow if you're on Instagram. And there was one other thing I was going to share related to what our students have been talking about. I'm blanking on it now, so you might have to come back to it. But that's been something very powerful from 17-year-olds is this understanding, and I think their generation really understands it, that environmental justice is racial justice, and you can't have one without the other.
Absolutely. Sister Mary Lou, I see you nodding.
Yeah, and I would just say that it's a civil rights issue. You know, it's about us and understanding civil rights, and I think too often, the people, as you said, Emily, are affected by the Black and brown communities are affected much more than where they live and the effects of the environment, of toxins and all those kinds of things. And unfortunately are not at the decision-making tables. And I think with this, maybe this administration, perhaps we can have more representation, especially in the Biden cabinet, of people of color, that hopefully that it will get to local municipalities so that we're able to really discuss some important things that really affect just everybody's day in, day out of living in toxins and pollution and things.
Mm-hmm. Recent history has illuminated at least some of the scope of the problems we face related to racism. And for many of us, that means recognizing the importance of addressing racism within our own circles. How do we have conversations with our friends and family about their racist beliefs?
I'm going to start. Can I start?
Go ahead.
Only because I think we need to start.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I just had a lunch today with my staff, and we're equally diverse in some way of culture. And so you got to talk about it. You got to bring it up. White people got to talk about it, and they got to talk about it themselves. We have to have ownership of what my microaggressions are. I have to be aware of my microaggressions. And if you don't know what microaggression is, look it up, because we all have them. All people that look like me, you have them and you don't even know you're saying them. You don't even know you're doing that. And so we have to have places where you can have really important conversations. So, and you know, the first place you think you could start is at your family, but there are people in my family. I have a sister and 3 brothers. There are certain people I could talk to about it, and there are other people that I don't dare. I say certain things and I challenge them. I call them upon things that no, that's inappropriate, and it stops, you know. But you have to be able to bring it up in places where it's uncomfortable, and the workplace, around our dinner tables, and not just with people that look like us, look like me, but I have to find out, how do I have those conversations? Pax Christi is having a great book kind of Zoom book club, and they're having conversations there. Because of the pandemic, people are having conversations all over about race. And so I really think that we have to just start, and I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to say something stupid. It's okay if it's coming out of my heart and I'm really trying to learn. That's what I ask my colleagues. Teach me. What do you think about this? Is this, you know, tell me what this means to you, because being socialized as a white educated woman, I don't know. Sometimes I don't know. I'm learning, but I have to be able to be open to learning.
Mm-hmm. It's so easy, I think, to misstep in spite of our best intentions. So I love that you've presented that as a reality of the situation, and that we have to lean into those conversations anyway. Anything to add, Emily and Sister Patricia, to tips on how to start those conversations?
I was going to add, I have one white parent and one Filipino parent. So I think about this in different ways. So definitely adding on with what Sister Mary Lou was saying when we think about this within white circles. But I also think it's really important for those of us who are Filipino, Mexican American, Latino, to think about anti-Blackness within our own communities. So within Filipino culture, there's a lot of colorism and there's a lot of anti-Blackness. And also in the Mexican American community where I work, it's a really important subject, and it's kind of under discussed, the idea of anti-Blackness. So that's something I just wanted to add to the conversation as well, is that other people of color also have this responsibility in a particular way when it comes to our Black brothers and sisters. Is how does racism play a role even within communities of color? And so that's just something I think is so important and something that's under discussed.
Sister Patricia?
Yeah, Emily, I totally agree with you. I think because people of color grew up with this anti-Blackness, it's everywhere. And we even take that on as not being acceptable. The other thing that I think is that white people have to learn their own story and be able to tell it. So even starting out the way we did, you know, what was your first realization of there being, you know, a race issue? And then talking with each other about it. You know, how did you feel about people of color then? And how do you feel now? So I think those kinds of conversations, there's never been a racist incident to happen without a white person being present. So therefore, what did you go through? And I think until you can tell those stories, you have a hard time connecting with even how to get out of it. So I would, and that follows with my whole action item or action that we should have, that white people really need to learn to tell their own story in this whole racist piece.
Okay, and we're going to touch on that again near the end of the program. Let's talk about racism as it intersects with migration. What are some of the issues that we're seeing as a result of that? Mm-hmm. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'll start off. I think one of the things is that we have to remember is that countries really do look at what's happening in the United States. And we have the nerve to also look at what's happening in other countries as far as race relations are going on in those countries. And sometimes the United States will not even deal with the country if they think that their race relations are not legit. And at the same time, you know, those countries are saying, you know, why should we change when we look at your history? And so we have people migrating or leaving their own countries because of these treatments that they're feeling in their own countries. And we have them coming to a country, and I believe that they come here because we have the ability to do racial movements because of the injustice that people of color feel here in the United States. And I think that they're coming here because they want those same opportunities to be able to fight for their own freedom.
Any other thoughts, Emily or Sister Mary Lou, on racism as it relates to migration? Emily?
I saw Sister Mary Lou unmute.
Oh.
So
Okay, either one.
You're funny, Emily. I guess, you know, when you look at the border, everybody somewhere in this country had people immigrated from somewhere. And now what we're doing to Black and brown people, that has really just been horrific. And I would say, you know, how many children are at the border that are unaccompanied, and so somehow we have to have conversations, or it's so connected, and we have to do something. And people get so irate about it; they really get so angry. And it just seems to me, I just don't understand it, because I said, well, where did your people come from? Where you're not Native American, where did your folks come from? And it's kind of like, that's not even the issue. And because I think, because we really look at who's coming into our country right now, it's people of color, Black and brown people coming from Central America and other places, but mostly at the border where that takes the most thing. We really have to look at those racist roots and come to some type of, how long have we been talking about comprehensive immigration reform? And we just can't have it. And until we change the makeup of the Congress, I don't think it'll ever happen. So I think discussions and conversations constantly with our elected officials, and really trying to move it ahead in a more appropriate way, is going to help us.
Emily, anything to add to that?
I was just going to add that this is a topic that's very humanized for me every single day. So I work every day with hundreds of first-generation immigrant families. And my experience of being a teacher, in comparison to my teacher friends who do not teach first-generation immigrant students, is that immigrants in our country have access to so many virtues that many people do not have access to. So the amount of resilience that my students have shown this year during the pandemic to get after their education and to be the first person in their family to go to college is unlike any resilience I've ever seen. And I think oftentimes resilience is just code word for your ability to overcome oppression. So I don't think we can talk about resilience without talking about systems of oppression as well. But when people talk to me about what I do, and they're like, that must be so hard, that must be so tough, the students must be so tough, which is again, coded racism. I said, it must be hard for you that you don't know them. Like, has your life been hard that you don't have access to first-generation American children every day? Because the gratitude, the humility, the generosity of our families is unlike anything I've ever seen. And I would say the same about my mother and my side of my family that are first-generation immigrants as well. So that's, central to who we are as a country. And there's resources and assets and gifts that these immigrant families have that folks who aren't first-generation immigrants don't have. And I think the more that we center the richness of that culture, and the more we change that narrative of how we talk about immigrants, the easier it's going to be, I think, on a policy side to have a humane conversation about this. But I cannot say enough about my students. That's all I'll say. I'm done. I'll start crying if I keep going.
It's beautifully said. I love it. We have an audience question, and anyone can feel free to respond to this. How would you respond to some of our leaders wanting to prevent the discussion of critical race theory, especially the idea of systemic racism, since they feel it's harmful to students? It's a tough question, huh?
I think, yeah, because that it is just so wrong right now, what's going on. But I think what I would say to them is that get into the conversation of defining racism and seeing racism as being defined as prejudice plus misuse of power. And then have a conversation about power and who has power. And then what does power look like when it's misused? I think those are the kinds of conversations that we have to have. And that's a definition that was given by an anti-racism group called Crossroads. But that has been so meaningful for me to help people understand why we need to have these conversations, or we'll never get out of it. But we need to understand the misuse of power.
Mm-hmm. Emily, you're in school. You're an educator. Your thoughts on critical race theory?
And this question is very relevant to me because this is the big question within Catholic education right now. For me, it starts with the gospel. So when I think about who Jesus is, and the more that I'm rooted in scripture and the more I'm rooted in the life of Christ, it's hard for me to not think about who's on the margins. And it's hard for me to not think about the ways that Christ upended structures that oppressed people and didn't allow them to feel the dignity of their own personhood. So I think this is a conversation we can have that's straight from the gospel. And I think in many ways, I don't ever use the words critical race theory in my class because I think there's lots of ways to talk about it in ways that maybe are more comfortable for people who feel uncomfortable with that language. I don't know, that's a whole nother conversation, but I think for me, it starts with the gospel. It starts with the 7 principles of Catholic social teaching. So this is, for me, this is so important because of my racial identity, but it's even more important to me because of my faith identity and who Jesus is. And so I think that's a whole nother webinar for us to talk about critical race theory in education and pulling on both ends of that. But for me, this is something that is Christocentric and it's gospel-centered.
Yeah. We do have another audience question, but I know Sister Mary Lou's action item is going to get to this. So we're just going to roll into our action items. But first, I want to thank everyone in our audience who did submit questions for our panelists. And we're sorry that in our limited time, we just can't get to all of them, but we welcome you to continue the conversation, of course, in your own circles or on our Facebook page. So considering this insightful conversation, it's clear we have a lot to do in our nation to work toward racial justice. And to help us in our ongoing work, our panelists have each developed a recommended next step for us to help affect change. So Emily, let's start with you. Please tell us about your action item.
Sure. I want to give a shout out to the Roach Center at Boston College and Melanie Wittenbach, the director there. They've been doing so much good work around Catholic education and racial justice. And last summer, they had a book club for people who are Catholic educators, and we all read Racial Justice in the Catholic Church by Father Brian Messingale. And we did small groups every week about a chapter of the book each week. And so I thought that was so powerful. The text is incredibly powerful. You know, there's very limited text like this within the Catholic tradition, at least at this point. So my suggestion was to start a discussion group in your parish or in your ministry workplace or in your school, wherever you find Catholic community, and to read and talk about the book Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. So the book was powerful, but talking about each chapter of the book once a week and having that accountability to read and discuss, I found was incredibly formative. So that was my suggestion.
Great. Sister Patricia, tell us about your action item.
Well, again, my action item is to ask that not just people of color, but white people find your story in racial incidents, because I think it's not until then that you will really understand what this is all about and how it came about. And I hope that I gave the right definition. I hope I said racism equals prejudice plus misuse of power. And those conversations around what racism really is would be important in you finding your own story.
Perfect. Sister Mary Lou, I'm going to tell you that audience question now. Is there any kind of training on understanding systemic racism? And I know your action item ties right into that.
Sure. So use your friend Google. If you can't, type it in. Just, talk to your phone. And I've attended several different trainings. The one that was most recent before the pandemic was in Chicago with Chicago Roar. And it really looks at systemic racism from before we even got into this country. And you're with a group of people, and it was 2.5 days, and it was very intense. But it's something that has really helped me understand a lot of different things. So I know learning the history, really trying to figure out different small little things perhaps that are a blip on the history, but that had a big effect on systemic racism. And so to name those, there are a lot of different organizations now doing this in the pandemic. They're still going on, and it's Zoom. I'm not sure it's as good if you're in person or whatever, but Zoom works, I think. One of the things that we do from the after you attend the training, then you have a monthly convening session. And one of the questions that you have to ask is, how did my white supremacy show up during the last month? So it's a very humbling place. And I have to be very honest to say, and then we separate by color, that white people go together, and then people of color go together. And then we come back in to talk about different learnings and observations. But one of the things I've learned is, how do I show up when I'm the only white person walking into a room of people of color? And I never even thought about that. But I show up, and it's kind of like, when you walk in your family and you did something wrong, and everybody stops or everybody looks. It's some of those things. And so it's caused me to really take pause, to look at my own, white supremacy, and to really say, how does it show up? How does it rear? And not to beat myself up, but to say, okay, that's a learning, and what can I do about it? And how do I go about it? And it's in those conversations and in the comforts of being able to be honest with ourselves that we're going to move forward. So I really encourage, if you can't do the training, take an implicit bias test and find out about yourself. Again, Google implicit bias. You don't even know what you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Great action items. And thank you to all of you, all of our wonderful panelists, Sister Patricia, Sister Mary Lou, and Emily. We're truly grateful for your willingness to share your expertise on this topic.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Happy to be here.
Thank you, everybody.
And a thank you to everyone working behind the scenes to bring this program to life every month. Next month on Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Migration, Racism, and Climate, Ending Human Trafficking. The United Way reports that human trafficking is happening not just in other countries, but in all 50 of the United States. Victims who span all genders and age groups may be forced into marriage, child labor, domestic servitude, exploitation, and even migrant farming and factory work. How do we recognize human trafficking in our own cities? How do we ensure our consumer habits don't contribute to it? And how does human trafficking intersect with racism, migration, and climate? We'll explore all of this and more July 14th at 3 p.m. Central Time. Thank you for joining us today. This series is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Region 10. Visit our website, exploringintersections.org, to find resources mentioned in today's conversation or to register to attend our next program. We broadcast live every second Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Central. You can also download podcasts of our panel discussions from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or via our website. And be sure to connect with us for the continuing conversation on Facebook. I'm Charish Badzinski. Thanks for tuning in to Exploring Intersections.